Great. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, back by popular demand. If he decides he's not going to be an economic expert anymore, he might have a future in our business, or in the press office. So back, Daleep is back. He's going to give some brief comments at the top, take a few questions, then we'll do some briefing after then, and I'll just say at the top for anyone who needs to leave for TV, feel free to go. It's all fine. I will turn it over to Daleep now.
Thank you, Jen. Good to see all of you again, but this is a briefing I never wanted to give. I'd like to start by saying the prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine today as they suffer an unjustified, unprovoked, and premeditated attack by the Russian military forces. President Biden has said from the start of this crisis, if Putin chooses to invade, the cost to Russia will be immediate and profound, to its financial system, to its economy, to its technology base, and to its strategic position in the world. As the world has now witnessed, Putin has made his choice. He rejected diplomacy and chose war. And today, the president has announced our response. Because of Putin's choices, his flagrant violation of international law, and his utter disregard for the principles that underpin peace and security across the world, we will now ensure his decision is remembered as a strategic failure. Today, we impose an unprecedented package of financial sanctions and export restrictions in lockstep with our allies and partners that will isolate Russia from the global financial system, shut down its access to cutting-edge technology, and undercut Putin's strategic ambitions to diversify and modernize his economy. Let me walk you through a few specifics, and I'll be happy to take questions. On financial sanctions, I stood at this podium on Tuesday and said, we would impose the most severe sanctions ever levied on Russia if Putin proceeded with the invasion. Today, we're following through. We will impose sanctions on Russia's two largest financial institutions, Sberbank and VTB, which together hold more than half of the Russian banking system's assets, over $750 billion in total. For VTB, we will freeze all of its assets touching the U.S. financial system and prohibit U.S. persons from doing any business with the bank. For Sberbank, we will sever its access to the U.S. financial system. We'll also freeze the assets of and prohibit any business dealings with 3 additional Russian banks with combined assets of over $70 billion. We'll also restrict U.S. investors from providing debt or equity financing for 13 of the most critical Russian state-owned enterprises, which combined have estimated assets nearing $1.5 trillion. And finally, we'll also impose sanctions on the executives at these state-owned institutions, as well as additional Russian elites who are complicit in Putin's kleptocracy, and their family members. Those who've shared in the Kremlin's corrupt gains and stored their wealth in yachts and luxury condos and fancy cars will now share in the pain of these measures. In terms of the financial impact, as I said, these are the most impactful and significant sanctions the U.S. has ever taken. But financial sanctions are just one part of our response. We're also unveiling today an expansive and unprecedented set of export restrictions developed in historically close coordination with the European Union, Australia, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Taiwan. These new measures include sweeping restrictions on Russian military end users to impair Putin's military capabilities, and will also deny exports across Russia to sensitive cutting-edge technology, primarily targeting Russia's defense, aerospace, and maritime sectors. In total, the United States and our partners will effectively be cutting off more than half of all high-tech imports going into Russia. This includes curbing Russia's access to advanced semiconductors and other foundational technologies that Russia needs to diversify and modernize its economy. Working in tandem, these financial sanctions and the export controls will undercut Putin's aspirations to project power on the world stage. And those impacts intensified dramatically just today. The Russian stock market plunged over 30% at one point before being halted by local regulators. Russia's currency, the ruble, weakened to its weakest value on record against the dollar before the central bank intervened. And the price the market is charging the Russian government to borrow is now above 15%. These impacts over time will translate into higher inflation, higher interest rates, lower purchasing power, lower investment, lower productive capacity, lower growth, and lower living standards in Russia. To be clear, this is not the outcome we wanted. It's both a tragedy for the people of Ukraine and a very raw deal for the Russian people. But Putin's war of choice has required that we do what we said, and to ensure this will be a strategic failure. Finally, let me just say a few words about the impact of Russia's choices on the U.S. We've intentionally scoped our sanctions to deliver severe impact on the Russian economy while minimizing the cost to the U.S. as well as our allies and partners. To be clear, our sanctions are not designed to cause any disruption to the current flow of energy from Russia to the world. We've carved out energy payments on a time-bound basis to allow for an orderly transition of these flows away from sanctioned institutions, and we provided other licenses to provide for an orderly wind down of business. Let me just stop there and take your questions.
I just had a real quick question. You said it would take some time before it affects the economy and inflation. What's the timetable? How long do you think it will take until you have demonstrable results?
Well, look, these are costs that build over time. And as I mentioned, I think last Friday, any leader, whether you're an autocrat or a small d Democrat, has to pay attention to the living standards of your country. And already we're seeing the effects of these measures and the signaling that we provided over the last 3 months. Before these sanctions were implemented, inflation in Russia was 8.7%. The government's borrowing costs had spiked above 10%. The ruble had lost almost 15% of its value. And today those costs escalated dramatically. Now it's going to be up to President Putin to decide ultimately how much cost he's willing to bear. But what we control is to make sure this will be a strategic failure, not just because of the sanctions, but also because of the export controls, because of Europe's accelerated diversification away from Russia in terms of its energy supply, due to our fortification of NATO's eastern flank, and due to the renewed energy and unity and determination by the West to stand up for our values and advance our principles.
But to confirm, you're in it for the long haul, right? You're until you see the results that you want.
We understand that these costs will accumulate over time.
You've just laid out all of the actions that the U.S. that our allies have taken at this point. As you understand, the questions, though, at this point are about the actions you have not yet chosen to take at this point, specifically the SWIFT system and sanctioning President Putin specifically himself. What are the triggers at this point? Are there actions that President Putin might still take you're expecting that would trigger those sanctions? Or what are the potential complications, especially about sanctioning Putin personally?
So I understand a lot of questions about SWIFT and about sanctioning President Putin and lots of other measures that could be mentioned. But let me say this. I think today was a demonstration that we mean what we say. We delivered on what we said we would do in terms of imposing costs. So when we say all options are on the table and that we're prepared to continue to ratchet costs higher, it would be a mistake to doubt that resolve. But let me also step back and say that when we consider which sanctions to apply, we're not cowboys and cowgirls pressing a button to impose costs. We follow a set of principles. We want the sanctions to be impactful enough to demonstrate our resolve and to show that we have the capacity to deliver overwhelming costs to Russia. That's one. Number two, we want them to be responsible, to avoid even the perception of targeting the average Russian civilian, and of course, unwanted spillovers back to the US or the global economy. Number three, we want to stay coordinated. And so we calibrate our sanctions to maximize the chance that we move in lockstep with our allies and partners. Number four, they should be flexible so that we can escalate or de-escalate depending on facts on the ground. And lastly, as I mentioned before, they have to be sustainable. These sanctions work over the long term. That's what will guide our design.
In light of the sanctions that were announced against individuals and entities in Belarus, can you tell us whether there are sanctions against any other countries that are being seriously considered at the moment? And what is the line that a nation would need to cross in this conflict for them to be on the receiving end of sanctions from the U.S.?
Well, the Belarus measures were about delivering cost to a country that aided and abetted what we saw yesterday and overnight. But I have nothing else for you in terms of other countries being targeted.
JJ.
Oh, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I know I didn't mean, I was confusing the arms here. You want to go in the middle?
Thank you, Daleep.
We'll come back to you.
I wanted to ask you about some of the carve-outs. There are general licenses for more than a dozen areas, agriculture, energy, and you just said that the importance is to limit the impact on Americans. But I was hoping that you could say, is there a percentage that you can share of the number of exemptions that make up the overall transactions? So the general licenses, what percentage of the transactions are under those licenses?
I would refer you to Treasury and OFAC for the details on what exactly is being exempted and the percentage of business that would be included.
I mean, could you say, is it a third? Is it a half? I mean, is it a small percentage? Is it a high percentage?
I would go back to the principles of our design. The measures themselves and the exemptions are balanced so that we can deliver overwhelming costs while not having unintended consequences. And so that's the principle. But as to the specifics, I'd refer you to Treasury.
Wouldn't the oil be a large percentage? I mean, considering how important it is to Russia's bottom line?
Well, look, where we have an asymmetric advantage is in foreign capital and cutting-edge technology. So that's where we're delivering the most concentrated impact. When it comes to energy, this is the one area where Russia has systemic importance in the global economy. We know it's the second largest natural gas producer in the world. It's also the second largest crude oil producer in the world. That's not to say that we have a dependence on Russia. Russia depends on those revenues just as much as the world needs its energy. But we're not going to do anything which causes an unintended disruption to the flow of energy as the global economic recovery is still underway.
Thanks. Two quick questions, actually. One, if Putin takes Kyiv, does that trigger additional sanctions, specifically that scenario?
Not going to speculate on particular hypotheticals.
And you mentioned the timeline. You've been asked about the timeline. The president said in one of the answers to his questions today, he said, let's have a conversation in a month to see if these sanctions are working. But my question is, what happens in the meantime? Russia is taking over parts of Ukraine, major parts of Ukraine, as we speak. So the world just sits back and watches that happen until these sanctions take effect.
Look, we can't dictate Putin's actions. What we can do is what's within our control, and to make sure this is going to be a strategic failure for Russia. And so over the course of the next month, what you can expect is that we'll see an intensifying negative feedback loop in Russian markets. And I've described the elements of that. You'll see record capital outflows. You'll see a weaker currency. You'll see higher inflation. You'll see lower purchasing power. You'll see lower investment. And that negative feedback loop, the velocity of it, is going to be determined by Putin's own actions. And so that's what you should expect on the financial sanctions front. On export controls, what you can see is that over time, this is going to atrophy Russia's capacity to diversify outside of just oil and gas and to modernize the strategic sectors that Putin himself has said he wants to develop: aerospace, defense, IT, lasers, sensors. These sectors all depend on foundational technologies designed and produced by the West. You will begin to see a chilling effect take hold in Russia as those inputs are denied.
Thank you. For weeks now, administration officials have repeatedly said, yourself included, that these sanctions are meant to deter and prevent Putin from moving forward, from acting. Can you help us understand why the president said today that no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening? And then secondly, on a quick one on Putin sanctions, without talking about when you might trigger them, can you help us understand what harm they would do to him personally if you were to sanction Putin?
Look, on your first question, we don't usually engage in hypotheticals up here at this podium, but let's play this out. Had we unleashed our entire package of financial sanctions preemptively, I think a couple of things might have happened. Number one, President Putin might have said, look, these people are not serious about diplomacy. They're not engaging in a good faith effort to promote peace. Instead, they're escalating. And that could provide a justification for him to escalate and invade. Secondly, he could look at it as a sunk cost. In other words, President Putin could think, I've already paid the price. Why don't I actually take what I paid for, which is Ukraine's freedom? So that's what we wanted to avoid. Look, ultimately, the goal of our sanctions is to make this a strategic failure for Russia. And let's define a little bit what that means. Strategic success in the 21st century is not about a physical land grab of territory. That's what Putin has done. In this century, strategic power is increasingly measured and exercised by economic strength, by technological sophistication, and your story, who you are, what your values are. Can you attract ideas and talent and goodwill? And on each of those measures, this will be a failure for Russia.
It's the same. I keep asking you the
I'm
same
sorry,
question.
I don't think,
She's not done yet. Let me just finish. Go ahead.
On President Putin.
but is it fair to say no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything? You certainly expected that, right?
Look, we signaled as clearly as we could what was coming if Russia proceeded with an invasion. As I mentioned before, economic costs of this severity generally matter to any leader because of the effect it has on his people's living standards. In this case, Putin made the wrong choice.
It's the same. How can you ensure? I keep asking you the same
JJ's
question.
asking a question.
How can you
Go
ensure
ahead,
that
Jared.
these
One more on
sanctions
SWIFT, please.
don't really affect
The
ordinary
UK has
people
been
in Russia?
pressuring allies to still reject Russia from the SWIFT system. Can you say if the US is still intensely working to pressure allies to do the same? How intensely are you guys pursuing
I can't
that?
comment on what the UK's position is. I'm not going to speak to that. But what I'll say is the sanctions measures we imposed today, I think without question, were the most consequential ever levied on Russia and arguably the most consequential ever levied in history, if you look at the aggregate financial impact on Russia. So that's why we took the measures that we did. And we did so because we could move in lockstep with our allies and partners, and because we think the spillover effects will be manageable.
I'm trying to figure out if this is still a realistic live round. Is the US really still making an intense effort for this, or is it essentially?
This being SWIFT? So look, again, I'm just going to repeat, all options are on the table, and we're prepared to ratchet costs higher at a time and place of our choosing. And, President Putin should take that seriously after what he saw today.
Michael?
It's the same. How do you ensure that these sanctions don't really affect
Let Michael ask his question. Go ahead, Michael.
Same question.
Just two questions. First, if you were to sanction Vladimir Putin, do you know where his money is?
Not going to comment on that.
And secondly, what is the message to Russia at this point on what it would take to roll back and relieve some of the sanctions that you put in place today?
Look, the road to diplomacy is always open. Diplomacy is never dead. But in the current circumstance, in the immediate aftermath of an invasion, that option is not available. Right now, we're imposing severe consequences on Russia for its decisions. If there were to be a shift in Russia's strategic choices that upheld core principles of respecting your neighbor's borders, respecting your neighbor's sovereignty, allowing countries to have the freedom to set their own course and their own destiny, that would be a different situation, but that's not where we are.
Tyler?
Mr. Singh.
You suggested that there's things that still remain on the table, but as you walk through the hypothetical scenarios of trying to keep diplomacy open, you said that they have now crossed the line. But if you're saying there's still more on the table, do you expect things to get worse in the coming days, that Russia will continue to move forward? Is that the intelligence? I know you guys have been quite transparent about the intelligence you have. Are you keeping things back because you think the situation is going to get worse?
I think we've been transparent to a remarkable degree. One aspect of that transparency is by saying we can't get into President Putin's head. And so your question requires me to speculate on how he's thinking about next steps, and I simply can't do that.
But just in terms of U.S. intelligence and the way that you are planning out the different sanctions you have and keeping things on the table, is that a sense that it will get worse because you want to hold things back?
Look, our job is to be prepared and manage risks, all manner of risks. And that's what we've been doing over the past 3 months as this crisis intensified. We'll continue doing that.
Last one from
Ensure
Steve.
that
Go
these
ahead.
sanctions
Just to follow
don't
up,
affect
follow up
ordinary
from
people in
Franco.
Russia.
The targeting the Russian energy industry is totally off the table. Is that what you're saying, Daleep?
What I'm saying is that our measures were not designed to disrupt in any way the current flow of energy from Russia to the world. Now, we have also said we are going to cut off Russia's access to cutting-edge technology. That technology can be used across many sectors. And so as it relates to Russia's long-term productive capacity We are seeking to degrade that capacity, but nothing in the short term as it relates to energy.
Thank you so much, Daleep. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jen.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.